Hello and welcome to Multiple Sclerosis News Today interview with Bruce Bebo of the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, who has joined us to give a wrap-up of the last 3.5 days at ECTRIMS 2017, the Multiple Sclerosis Conference that is concluding today in Paris, France. And thank you. Bruce, thank you very much for joining us.
I'm happy to be here, and no small feat to try to wrap up the last 3 days. It's been a lot to see and to be a part of, and so I'll do my best to try to wrap it up as clearly as possible.
Yeah, so we spoke to you before the meeting as well, and you mentioned a bunch of points actually that you were going to focus on. So now looking back at these 3.5 days of presentations, which stand out most prominently?
Yeah, so I think the few things that will stick in my memory for the longest time from this meeting are the Progressive Alliance presentations that happened on the first day. I was swelled with pride at having a part of that program, the International Progressive MS Alliance, which is a consortium or alliance of practically all the MS societies around the world, pooling resources, financial resources and human resources to focus on the problem of progressive MS. And we launched this initiative just a few years ago, and on whatever day that was, Wednesday or Thursday, there were probably close to 2,000 people in the room to listen to the talks by our 3 funded Global Collaborative Network Award winners. And so to go from sort of a humble few people in a room with this idea of putting together a global alliance to focus on answering the real hard questions about progressive MS, in a few years to being at the world's largest meeting of MS in a room full of 2,000 people with listening to talks from our 3 Global Collaborative Network Award winners was very rewarding, and it could take a very small amount of time to celebrate and then move on to the next step. But that will stick out for me. And so the 3 network awards, one is focused on drug discovery of potential strategies for promoting myelin repair. And one of the projects is also a drug discovery project focused on trying to find agents that are modulating the compartmentalized immune response that happens inside of the nervous system in progressive MS. And the other project is looking at trying to develop an outcome measure that could be used in a very quick phase 2 study to look at response to medications for progressive MS. So this is probably the biggest roadblock we have, and the reason why we don't have very many, or at this point one treatment for progressive forms of MS, is because there isn't a quick outcome measure at an early clinical development stage for response to therapy. And so that's what this other project is focused on, using MRI imaging and deep machine learning, which is as much as I know about that. I'm not an MRI expert. I just as deep machine learning. That's what I know. But Doug Arnold, who leads that project, is the world's authority on MRI images and collecting and getting those images from all of the clinical trials that have ever happened in progressive MS from all of the companies. Show the leverage and power and influence Doug has to get that work done. So I'm super excited to be here next year and hear more about what those projects are doing, but just felt very proud of that and that first day of the meeting to be in that room and know that I had some small role in helping get that work done. I was looking forward to the results from the Sprint MS trial, which we just minutes ago heard about. And it's very exciting to have a positive result in the progressive MS trial. The trial enrolled patients or people with secondary progressive and primary progressive MS, testing an agent called ibutylast, which the trial was inspired by a clinical trial in relapsing MS that showed was a negative outcome for relapsing MS, but in the MRI images showed some changes in the rate of brain atrophy to suggest it might work in progressive MS. So Bob Fox gets a ton of credit for initiating this study and running this study and leading it, which reported out literally minutes ago, and showed that there was, keeping in mind that that all of our brains are shrinking, and you can measure this shrinking on an MRI, and that if you live with MS, your brain's shrinking a little bit faster, and you can measure that difference on an MRI. And the best outcome measure we have that's for progressive MS right now is, can an agent or drug change that rate at which the brain's shrinking, or the rate of brain atrophy? So what we just learned literally minutes ago was this drug ibutylast could slow the rate of brain atrophy in people with either primary or secondary progressive MS by 48%, which is a very robust, very large effect for that drug. The other interesting part of the SPRINT MS trial is the first clinical trial in progressive MS using some more advanced imaging techniques to try to get at some other, or understand other mechanisms of action for this drug. So they used a technique called magnetization transfer ratio, which is just, in theory, is measuring the myelin in the nervous system, and again, just reported that they saw somewhere, I think it was 70 to 80% reduction in the rate of loss of that MTR signal, which suggests that there was some preservation of myelin in the treated group, and used another MRI technique called DTI, or what is DTI? Diffuser tensor imaging, thank you. That measures, we think, sort of tissue integrity, and while the signal wasn't statistically significant, there was a trend for a decrease in the rate of loss of that signal, suggesting that there was some hint that the participants on that drug, that the tissue integrity changes were less than they were in the placebo group. So very encouraging. That class of medication does have some side effects, mostly nausea, and that did appear in the trial, which is in some ways comforting, because we know that that's a common effect of this. But otherwise, no other real serious concerns around safety that came up in that. So I'm very encouraged by that. So SMART, I think that another interesting thing I'll leave the meeting with, again, was reported on the last day, was a result of the Paradigms clinical trial. So this is the first clinical trial that completed in pediatric MS. And so the first pediatric MS clinical trial in relapsing MS, and I mean, in a nutshell, showed a quite positive outcome, inhibiting the relapse rate. I think it was by around 80% or so, which is, my recollection, it was even more potent than the result we saw in adults. And this is Gilenya, treating pediatric patients with Gilenya. Really doing pediatric studies in MS is very, very challenging. So I applaud the investigators for completing the first ever trial in pediatric MS. So that's a milestone. Even better that it was positive, and just a real advance for treatment in MS. I'd say the other takeaways for me were the continued, a lot of the research that reports out at this meeting are extension studies of a lot of the medications we have to continue to monitor their safety, continue to understand their effectiveness and who's going to respond and who's going to not. So there's really not enough time to go into the details of every single one, but I think the point to share with the listeners and viewers is that probably all of the MS medications are all being followed on in extension studies, that we're growing understanding of the safety and effectiveness and of who are the most appropriate people to take the different medications. And then every year we learn a little bit more about all of the medications and their side effects and their benefits. And I think another takeaway for me is there are a lot of efforts now to collect natural history data from people living with MS. So a lot of we can learn from studying MRIs over a few months, or taking blood and looking at cells, or but there are some of the big questions in MS, like why does one person get progressive MS and why another one doesn't? Why someone's MS progresses really slowly and why another one's is real fast? How we can determine who's going to respond to therapy and who's not going to respond to therapy. Those are big questions that can only really be answered in natural history studies, where we follow people living with MS for a long time. And so there are a number of those, a lot of results this week from a lot of different efforts, looking at results from natural history studies to start to try to answer some of those questions. So I don't have answers for those questions right now, but I think it's inspiring to know that there are a lot of efforts from around the world collecting data from people living with MS over a long period of time, so that we can begin to answer some of those questions and be able to provide guidance around what medications might work for which person, who's most likely to have a more severe course of disease or more benign course of disease. And so we get hints of those at each one of these meetings and get a little bit closer to that understanding every time we were at an ECTRIMS meeting. And I was inspired by the number of those efforts and the knowledge we're gaining from following the natural history of MS over a long period of time.
So, do you think that the data from the pediatric study or the outcome of the study will open up for more studies in children?
So that's a great question. I think, when a drug gets approved for an adult indication like MS, the authorities, both the European authorities and the U.S. authorities, the FDA and the EMA, requires the manufacturer to do a pediatric study. Now, some drugs or some companies get a waiver for that depending on whether that drug is just appropriate for using in children or not. So, for example, if it's a toxin that might be inappropriate to treat a child with, you can get a waiver. But more often than not, all the clinical trials we see for MS drugs in adults are dictated by the authorities that you have to do a pediatric trial. So there are a number of ongoing pediatric trials in MS, and I hope that we hear outcomes from some of those trials in future meetings. Now, the challenge is there are very few pediatric MS patients in the world. I've heard an estimate that it might be around 3,000. I've also heard estimates that out of those 3,000, only a subset of those 3,000 actually are in a position to participate in a clinical trial. So the paradigm study we heard today, I think it was 120 or 140 children. I mean, that's 10% maybe of the total number of children that are in a position to participate in a clinical trial. So they're very hard to recruit for, and difficult to complete. So that's what actually is one of the very encouraging things, that Paradigm's actually finished a clinical trial. It's the first one that completed. So I hope there are several ongoing other clinical trials testing the approved agents. Many of them are having difficult times enrolling because it's just a hard thing to do, and I hope that the positive result from this trial might inspire those studies to enroll and finish and have more information about the appropriate use of these agents in the pediatric population. It's really, I went to, there's an international pediatric MS study group that met the day before the meeting, and I learned a lot about what the challenges were for doing a pediatric MS clinical trial, and they're multifold, and so it's the reason why we haven't had as many results as we would like. But very encouraged by the Paradigms trial, and perhaps it will create a pathway for the other studies to enroll and complete.
So, just as in our interview with you before the meeting, you mainly focused on progressive MS. So, were there any highlights in relapsing MS research that you want to mention?
So we just what was the study that just was reported? I'm looking at my notes. This last, just at this last meeting. Hold on. Paradigms and so I think mainly what I saw, and this is an example. Mainly what I saw were enhancements to the current treatments we have for relapsing MS. So the trial result that was just reported again at the last session of the meeting was a Radiance trial. It was in relapsing remitting MS, and it was testing a drug called ozanimod, which sounds like fingolimod, which is Gilenya. So ozanimod is a follow-on, hopefully improved version of Gilenya that was tested in a really large clinical trial of about 1,300 people and showed a robust inhibition in the rate of relapses and showed MRI signals that were consistent with the clinical result and as data that would be used to support authorization for marketing with the FDA and the European authorities. I'm assuming that's the next step for that. And the news for people living with MS is that in theory, this would be an agent that would be as efficacious or perhaps slightly better than Gilenya, but would have reduced side effects. So there are a number of these. They all end in mod. So you have siponimod and ozanimod and fingolimod. But there are enhancements over the initial drug that hopefully have improved effectiveness and better safety that are, I'd say, incremental but important steps. So I from a sort of clinical trial point of view, that's what I saw a lot this week were enhancements to existing therapies for relapsing MS that hopefully would result in agents that are more effective, have less side effects, perhaps more convenient, so as far as how they're dosed. And I would say that's my initial reaction to what I saw about relapsing MS was mostly enhancements to the treatments that we have. Anything else is very early stage, and these certainly are a lot of preclinical work in relapsing remitting and maybe early clinical work, testing a lot of different mechanisms or approaches that are quite ready to get to the clinical stage, that where we may see those approaches in a clinical stage in later meetings. But still a lot of activity in that space, just hard to give everyone the depth and breadth of all of that work, because there were 2,000 abstracts this week, and I don't know how many presentations, and 10,000 people here. So to try to get at all of that is hard. But I would just say my takeaway impression was a lot of progress being made on enhancements to some of the treatments that we have now for relapsing MS.
There were two, I think you sort of answered one of them. There were two reader questions that came out that we couldn't exactly answer, and so we did tell them we would run them by you. I think you kind of addressed it. What could MSers be excited about coming out of ECTRIMS? Yeah,
I think the excitement is a focus on progressive MS. I mean, we have 14 disease-modifying therapies now for relapsing remitting MS. We haven't cured it yet, so no one's giving up on relapsing MS. But the real, unmet need is trying to solve the solution for about half the people in the world that are living with the progressive form of MS. And the attention that the Progressive Alliance has drawn towards that problem has become clear at these meetings, where there are a lot more presentations and a lot more interest in progressive MS. And as a consequence, we've seen a lot of progress in development of new treatments for progressive MS, which is at this meeting highlighted by the positive results from the SPRINT MS trial that were just reported. But I think that I think as someone living with MS, you could be excited about the fact that there were 10,000 people at this meeting, for 3 or 4 days that were just focused on MS. So there are other meetings in the world. There are neurology meetings and immunology meetings, and where MS research is shared and discussed and presented, but it's not the sole focus of those meetings. This is a meeting that's just focused only on MS. And there were 10,000 people here, all focusing their whole career, their whole lives on MS, which is incredibly exciting. And 2,000 posters, and I don't know how many presentations, all sharing advances in MS research, particularly, again, I think from the point of view of someone with MS, rapid advances that are being made in understanding of progressive MS and clinical trials that are revealing that knowledge is being translated potentially into treatments to help those people, the half of the people that I work for, that'll live with the progressive form of MS. So that, I think, is the most exciting thing for me.
Is there any developments in stem cell therapies coming up for MS?
So, yeah, I think there's a lot of growing interest and appreciation in the hematopoietic stem cell transplantation approach. There are a couple of ongoing clinical trials. So just in a quick description, this is a strategy to reboot your immune system by removing your blood stem cells, treating a person with chemotherapy to more or less kill or partially or fully kill their existing immune system, and then replacing their immune system using these stem cells, and basically resetting their immune system in a way that stops the immune damaging or the nervous system damaging immune reaction. And there have been a lot of case studies, a lot of open label trials, enough all over the world to suggest that this is a promising area of research. It's risky, but it has potentially a very long-lived and strong benefit. So there are 2 ongoing clinical trials that are rigorous, blinded as much as you can blind them, controlled trials in this hematopoietic stem cell transplant approach to hopefully once and for all determine the benefit and the risk and give the community a sense for who's most likely to benefit from this and who's not. So there were a lot of the plans and some preliminary data from those clinical trials was shared this week, but not the top-line results aren't quite ready yet. So I think in the next meeting, or perhaps the one after that, we'll have more definitive information about that. There are people using the other kinds of stem cells, called mesenchymal stem cells, or MSCs, maybe people have heard. They can also be derived from the bone marrow or from the adipose or almost any tissue. There's the idea is that these cells can secrete factors that can promote repair and inhibit immune reactions. And there have been some clinical trials of these agents, and we're still, I think it's inconclusive how and if and how these mesenchymal stem cells work. I would more encouraged by some of the work I saw this week looking at factors that those cells produce and the ability of those factors to promote repair. That I think may be a more promising approach than actually transplanting the cells. We'll see. At the Society, we're going to fund research, all that research, whether it's cell-based or molecule-based. My personal bias is I think we're going to identify factors those cells make. That would be a more useful approach to therapy. So a lot of focus on natural repairs, how I like to refer to it. So these are agents that exist in our own bodies that we know can promote repair, and some that can inhibit repair, and understanding the balance of those and how we can alter the balance in favor of promoting repair. So there's a lot of activity in that area at the meeting this week, and just in the MS research in general about promoting natural repair. And so I'm encouraged by that.
Bruce, thank you very much. Is there any final concluding message you would like to make to the You've covered quite a few, but
I just was so proud of the work of the Progressive Alliance, and it's making significant and impactful investments in research, but also drawing so much attention to the question of progressive MS that beyond just the funding, it's inspired the research community to pursue real specific areas of research that have been identified as priority areas by the Alliance that I think is catalyzing the field of progressive MS, which is, I think, indicative of the number of people attending the sessions on progressive MS, the number of presentations that were made, the number of posters that were made. I think it's the most attention I've seen to progressive MS in any meeting I've been to before. So I'm inspired by that and proud, honestly, that of the role the small role I've played, the role my team has played, and the society and all the other MS societies around the world have played to focus the attention of the world on that problem. So,
thank you very much for joining us here today, Bruce.
Happy to be here. Yeah, thanks.